Hello, I'm Philip Hughes, and this is the second film on preparing your data for analysis, focusing on what you need to examine and perhaps correct or add on the data sheet itself. We'll be looking at issues of coding open-ended questions, dealing with missing data, and creating scales. You now need to check the data and check that all the data is in the right column. This is often a particular problem if you've imported a CSV file. If people have written things into an open-ended question and used commas, it can throw the data out of alignment. And so you'll find that some of the data after those open-ended questions is not in the correct column. The best thing to do is to run descriptions on all numeric variables, looking at the maximum scores. Are all of them okay? Do they correspond to what you'd expect from the survey itself? Or do you have some larger scores that should not be where they are? You may have to manually look at the data and manually move scores so they're in the correct columns. Look at the end of each line. Are these lines lined up correctly? You may well have textual responses to open-ended questions. You may have allowed people to add their own other responses. For example, if you've asked them about their religious identity and given them a list there in which they could choose one member of the list, you'd probably have the option for them to add a different religious identity at the bottom of the list. Have a look at those. If quite a few people have added a particular other response, you may want to add an additional code to that question so that they can be in the numerical coding. Or you may want to recode them into items on the pre-existing list. It's quite common, for example, for people to actually mention a specific church rather than a denomination. But you know from the church they've entered what denomination it is, and so you can recode that back into that numerical question of religious identity. There are two ways of analysing open-ended responses. You can create numerical codes for them so that they can be analysed numerically, or you can analyse them as open-ended responses, in which case you'll be moving through them, categorising the various responses and writing them up without going to the point of putting a number to particular sorts of responses. Now back to the question of missing data. What do you do when people do not respond to an item? You need to ask why they haven't responded. I did some analysis, for example, of why people didn't respond to the census question about religious identity. About 10% in most censuses do not respond to the religion question. It's an optional question on the census, but why didn't they respond? A closer look showed that nearly half of them did not respond to the census at all. They actually didn't fill in a form. The census actually misses people on boats, people in gated communities in inner cities, some people in nursing homes and hospitals, and so the form was never filled in. It's highly likely that those people have a profile similar to others in the community. Others have not responded because they believe that this has nothing to do with government. Exclusive brethren actually take a line on this, and they don't believe you should answer that question. But there's also, when one looks at the ethnicity of these people who don't answer, you actually find that there's quite high numbers from particular countries, some of the Middle Eastern countries, for example, where people perhaps are a little suspicious of government and their interest in what religion they are. But there are others who are not responding because they're not interested in the question. They don't feel that it it's a private matter, it doesn't have anything, and in fact they don't attend church. So and don't have a religious identity. So with missing data, you must ask why. Have they just missed out that part of the survey? Or have they deliberately missed out that question for some particular reason? Answering that will help you to judge how you recode that question, or leave them out of any results about attendance. They're difficult judgments to make, and you may make them differently according to different forms of analysis that you're doing. Another job to do as you prepare your data for analysis is the creation of scales. It's quite likely that you've included a number of items in your survey which are part of scales. Personality scales, for example, scales that are measuring some particular construct of human behaviour or human feelings, human emotions. Some of the items in the scale may need to be reverse coded. A good questionnaire actually has some positive items, some negative items, so that people don't respond to all the items in the same way and without thinking closely to them, about them. So you'll need to reverse code those items which say were negative, so they're all heading in the same direction. You then check the scales using Cronbach's alpha. You look at whether all the items in the scale are contributing and are highly correlated with the scale as a whole. Ideally, you'd be looking for an alpha score of 0.7 or higher. That'd be indicative of a fairly strong scale. And you'd be certainly looking at each of the items in the scale and whether each of the items are adding to the scale. Having determined that they are, then you add those items together to create your new scale item, which you can then use in your analysis. Finally, there's weighting the data. If you're trying to accurately represent what a larger population is thinking, you may well need to weight your data. Certainly we do this with national surveys. But you may also do it with other surveys and so on too. If you're doing a survey of a large congregation, for example, and you've done a randomised survey, but you want to have a sense of what the whole congregation might think, then you might weight your data according to what you know of the congregation overall. You give a weight to each person's responses so that overall your survey has similar proportions to the larger population in certain characteristics. It's often done with age and gender, for example. So if you divide the age into certain groups, if you know how many males and females and of what age groups there are in your population, then you can weight your survey so that it reflects accurately that population. The formula for calculating those weights is that the weight is equal to the percentage in the population divided by the percentage in your sample. Or you can do it by writing a little macro that actually automatically does it, so that for each female of a certain age group you put in a certain number, of different age groups will have different numbers, males will have different numbers, and so on. So you may have 6 or 8 different weights that you put in to your survey. And then you use the facility within the PSPP or within SPSS to turn on the weighting. Remember that you turn it on for frequencies, for cross-tabulations, for all those statistics where you're actually trying to describe the wider population. You turn off the weighting for deeper analysis within the data, looking at how the data actually works, for example in regression analysis. So having worked through all of those issues of coding, of the missing data, of weighting data, of creating the scales and so on, now you're ready to begin your analysis.